Welcome to Stereo 3D Productions and this second generation VorpX Universal Guide, applicable to VorpX version 18 and above. It's once again time to connect a coffee IV to yourself, sit down and try to relax. Things may have gotten simpler for VorpX, but this new Universal Guide is still going to be a pretty bulky video, as I'm trying to make sure I have all the bases covered. VorpX have just pushed a few updates that considerably change the way you configure a game. For the most part, things have gotten way easier. It's a big enough change that it might even make my tutorial processes somewhat shorter. That being said, there are some cases like for example Shadow Warrior 2, where things are just as tricky as they used to be, but like in almost all cases, that configuration results in a pretty excellent VR adventure. Just like with my first generation series of tutorials, videos that get updated will see the old version have the tag outdated or updated in the title. Outdated means the video in question has been completely remade with new information, while updated means there's a follow-up video available for the given tutorial. If you see this in the title, check the top of the description for a link to the updated version or follow-up video to the one you're watching. While VorpX can sometimes be complicated, albeit frustrating, and while there's a good lot of games that we've all tried to get working with it that failed miserably, VorpX has also unearthed some absolute gold for virtual reality. It's my most used VR app to date, having allowed me to exist in dozens of different game worlds. When you know what you're doing, and also when you know where you're going, VorpX can be the single best thing to do in VR right now. The app itself has gone through important changes in version 18, and it's made itself a lot easier to use. Some of the changes you'll notice are: first, there is no more settings optimizer. Instead, VorpX now changes game settings on the fly, and the process has become somewhat more reliable, landing you a correct field of view value almost every time with no work. Second, you'll notice partial DirectVR support much more often. For some games, VorpX will just bypass settings and enforce field of view values using DirectVR. Finally, the new VorpX even has some built-in game resolution options which can help in some scenarios. Often, the resolution can even be toggled directly from the VorpX in-game menu. While this cuts configuration time somewhat, in a few cases we'll have to take extra steps to force in higher custom resolutions, but by all means, this new option has proven quite useful, making stock configurations a lot easier. I've played a handful of games to record footage for this guide, and in almost every case I was able to play right away without doing any configuration whatsoever, even for the games I had just freshly installed. The information here is mostly to help you get acquainted with this tool and understand the important options, but for the most part, you too should now be able to play what you want without even knowing how to use VorpX. It's become a very plug-and-play system, and I've honestly been caught by surprise at how little I had to do to get any game going. I very much dare you to go buy VorpX now if you don't own it. Take your favorite game and try it out. You will not be disappointed. That being said, VorpX is quite a behemoth with tons of options, and this guide is designed to help you better understand those, and should help a lot in exclusive cases where a game needs some special procedure to get working. At the beginning, there is a game. The game is installed, and you want to play it in VR, but not so fast. You have to run the game at least once in 2D before you get to do that. Most games will write their configuration files the first time you run them, and they might even pop in a few important prerequisites on the way. In addition to allowing the game to settle in on your computer, you can take this opportunity to go in the game's options and change graphics settings when they're available. Having the game running in 2D on your desktop, go into the game's graphics options. The latest version of VorpX is known to override a lot of settings, but there are a few options you'll still need to customize, and we'll go over the common stuff here. Depending on which game we're playing, these might be changed down the line, or we might simply ask VorpX not to take control of these, but let's take a look at what we usually change so we know what we're in for down the line. Remember to always consult PC Gaming Wiki, I'm going to put a link in the description, if there's any setting in a game that you cannot find. First, in any graphics settings, Anti-aliasing is very important. If MSAA is available in the game, high-end GPUs can run MSAA 4X at 1280 by 1024, which looks about as good as 1600 by 1200 without any AA at all. It's a nice feature to have, but it's incredibly costly and will force you to trade off a lot of performance even at the high end. Leave it off or use that with caution. If any other AA method is available, such as MLAA, TAA, or SMAA, only use it if you plan on running the game at the lower res of 1280 by 1024. With any higher resolution, artificial AA techniques won't be of much help and might go as far as blurring the image too much. In most games, there are a few unwanted graphics options you'll want to turn off. Some we want to kill with fire even. Your biggest enemy is motion blur. Make sure to turn it off or you definitely won't have a good time at all. Your next biggest enemy is VSync, or frame rate cap/limit. VSync can cause a 2 to 3 frame lag in your game and make the asynchronous time warp overshoot insanely, giving a very floaty feeling. Another effect you want to disable is SSAO. It's not convincing for most games in VR, and it costs your GPU a fortune to render. Depth of field is also an undesirable, expensive effect that will simply blur your view till you think you need glasses. Off is best in most cases, but there are some exceptions like BioShock Infinite, where the effect is used for an artistic style rather than image enhancement. Be careful with shadows. For one, VorpX will sometimes need dynamic shadows forced off in order to avoid eyesores in Geometry 3D. It's one thing to have to render shadows in the first place, they're extremely costly, but it's another to render them and not even display them. Start at low. For a low-end GPU, turn them off if you can. If you're interested in improving them later, you can always revisit settings or tweak them in the configuration files of the game directly. The general rule of thumb here is to take it easy on the settings. Start with low on under-spec GPUs, and even on the higher end, I recommend you try medium range settings before rushing into high. Aside for options that consume pure memory like texture quality and anisotropic filtering, most GPUs including a 970 have plenty of memory, those can be on ultra, but most other settings shouldn't be overdone too early in. Start with a conservative approach and keep in mind that things like shadows, particles, and post-process effects are very costly. While most games do have extensive settings, it's possible that with quite a few titles, you'll need to break into the game's configuration files, look for keys in the registry, or even use a third-party plugin like Flawless Widescreen to force some options like field of view and heads-up display tweaks. Again, it's worth taking the time to visit PC Gaming Wiki to see if there are instructions to access the setting you need in order to prepare your game for VorpX. By the way, if you're using SteamVR, there is one very important step to take if you want VorpX to work correctly. Make absolutely sure to disable Steam's annoying desktop game theater. This feature can be useful if you don't plan on using VorpX at all, as it will display any non-VR game in a sort of 2D movie theater when you launch it with SteamVR running. This, however, will also override VorpX and cause it not to work, so you need to turn that option off. In Steam, click on Steam on the top left and go to Settings. In the Settings window, click In-Game. Uncheck Use Desktop Game Theater when launching desktop games while SteamVR is active, then hit OK. With that option off, you'll be sure there is no conflict between VorpX and Steam. Anyway, VorpX does have its own game theater option which provides many more features than Steam's desktop theater, such as playing on a virtual 3D screen. I want to note that VorpX does have 3 display modes for you to play games with: Full VR, Immersive Screen, and Cinema mode. This video and most of my tutorials only apply to Full VR mode. I have previously found good uses for the other 2 modes, and I may cover them at some point in the future. In fact, my friend Eincro from Eincro Productions Co. and Red Pill Gaming Reviews has covered the game Diablo 3 on my channel, a game that works great with VorpX's Cinema mode. but those modes are far easier to configure and thus require less attention from our part. I have in the past switched VorpX to cinema mode when a game started playing cutscenes, but my experience with the feature is very limited as I tend to much prefer playing with a full VR output most of the time. There used to be a time where we'd have to use something called the Game Settings Optimizer in order to prepare a game to be played with VorpX. These days are now over and the optimizer is gone. In the latest distribution of VorpX, automatic settings changes are done directly when you launch the game with VorpX, and you don't have to worry about applying anything beforehand. The feature now performing these changes is known as DirectVR. For a large number of games, DirectVR will be able to configure your field of view setting, the game's resolution, and many other settings that can cause problems in VR if not set correctly. However, this does come with a downside. When we need to run a fully custom configuration, we're going to have to ask DirectVR to get out of the way in part, or in some cases completely. For starters, we're going to look at the ideal, easiest configurations, where DirectVR takes charge of some or all of the required settings in order to run well in VR. Ultimately, DirectVR can set everything from your head tracking to your field of view, game resolution, and internal settings with one simple step. This includes games like Fallout 4 and BioShock Infinite, and many more on the growing list of fully DirectVR-enabled games. When a game supports all of DirectVR's features, we won't have to worry about any complicated configurations. One single scan will result in a perfect field of view, ideal head tracking, a correct game resolution, and no frame latency. When a game supports DirectVR in full, you won't need any previous experience with VorpX and should be able to enjoy the software and the game you're playing right out of the box with little to no effort. Let's take a look at how the flow goes with a game that fully supports DirectVR. If you've never run the game in question before, just launch it once in 2D without VorpX running. No need to play it, just make it to the opening menu and close the game right away. This makes sure we've got the game's configuration files written to our hard disk. Next, launch the game in VR with your runtimes, either Oculus Home or SteamVR running, and VorpX started. The game will go VR right away, but you'll get a message about needing to restart the title due to configuration changes. Do this. Again, we make it to the title screen and quit. Start the game one last time, again with the runtimes and VorpX ready to go. At this point, you can begin playing. Make it past any introduction movies and cutscenes. Wait for the game to give you full autonomous control. This is the point at which you want to run your DirectVR scan. Open VorpX's in-game menu by pressing the delete key, and from the main settings category, or the DirectVR settings category, select the Run DirectVR Scan button and press enter. Yes, VorpX has a hotkey to run the DirectVR scan, but I often avoid it as the key will conflict with a control in the game and cause a menu to open, which will result in a failed DirectVR scan. I've found using the button itself the safest way to run a scan. The scan will execute, set your field of view, head tracking, and other features such as positional, and voila! If it succeeds, you're good to go. If you ever see a scan fail, there are a few known causes. First is running the scan while in a cutscene or while watching the game's videos. Never run your scan unless you are in the game world with full autonomous controls. The next cause can be standing too close to world geometry. If you're in a room, try to stand in the middle of it, away from all the walls. If you can take your player outside in the game world, do that. It'll lower your chances of having a problem even more. Last known issue causing scans to fail is having a game menu open, such as the pause menu, the inventory, or the map. Make sure you have none of this open when you start a scan, and make sure if you're using the hotkey that it's not causing one of these to open. In some rare instances, a scan will fail due to issues between VorpX and the game. The last resort I've tried in that situation is to restart both VorpX and the game, reload the save, and try the scan again. This situation is rare, but I recall having monumental problems using DirectVR with Dishonored, to the point where my tutorial on it featured an alternate, fully manual VR configuration to fall back to in case others experienced the same glitches. A fully DirectVR enabled game is most often worry-free and should get you playing some of your favorite titles in excellent virtual reality in no time. I'll try to make a list of the games I know for a fact work correctly with DirectVR, and I'll post it in the description of this very video and try to keep it up to date. Now, the most common setup scenario you'll come across with VorpX is a partial DirectVR support. Odds are very high that you'll have a game that VorpX can configure the field of view for without any effort, and the stock configuration may even feature correct head tracking settings. In these cases, I'll often want to tweak the game's other settings, such as resolution, VSync, and other elements that are important for a fluent VR experience. In either case, whether a game fully supports DirectVR or not, it's often worth our time to enhance these configurations with a few extra custom steps. I play some of these games for several hours. I've always enjoyed trying to improve at least one thing every time I come back to a given title. If you've followed my tutorial series, a lot of procedures I demonstrate are the product of things I've discovered over multiple sessions. DirectVR has made VorpX easier to use by orders of magnitude, but it's still often worth trying to put in a little bit of time to make things even better than they already are. The more you do, the closer these VR experiences get to a real out-of-the-box VR-ready game. A less common scenario you'll come across now is a fully custom configuration. I call this type of setup a manual VR configuration. Get ready, this is by far the longest segment of this video, as I'm going to cover nearly everything you need to do, assuming DirectVR is dead and non-existent. This has now become rare, but there are still cases where it's up to you to configure absolutely everything, from field of view to head tracking, graphical settings to 3D options, and so on. In fact, some games will give you better results with manual VR configurations, despite the fact that they already have partial DirectVR support. Shadow Warrior 2 is one great example of this. As far as VorpX has gone with automation, you'll still see quite a few manual VR setups in my tutorial series. But don't worry, I'll keep those as simple as possible so everyone can enjoy as many games as they can down the line. A lot of the information I cover in this segment can be used in the case of a partial DirectVR support as well. Keep in mind that most of what I demonstrate in this section is highly detailed, and you'll often only need to use a fraction of this process. It's extremely rare that you'll need to go through all the steps. If you're stuck doing a fully end-to-end manual configuration, it's likely the game you're trying to run doesn't even have a VorpX profile for it, which means you'll need to create a custom one. This was the case for me with Layers of Fear. When VorpX has no built-in profile for a given game, first find out what engine your game is running on. For Layers of Fear, I found it was built on Unity 5. The next step was to find out if VorpX has any Unity 5 profiles built in. I discovered that it had a profile for Firewatch, which is also a Unity 5 game. Once you've discovered the engine your game uses and have found an existing VorpX profile for a game with the same engine, open the VorpX configuration utility, go in Local Profiles, and select the built-in profile for the game using the same engine. In my case, I'm selecting the Firewatch profile. Click on Create a new profile based on this one. Rename your profile. Personally, I like to keep the name of the original profile and add the custom game's name at the end so I know what I based it on. Hit OK and your new profile will be created. Click the Add button under Assigned Programs. Next, find the game's main program file, in this case, Layers of Fear sub.exe. Select it and click Open. Your game's exe file should now be bound to your new custom profile. You can, at this point, close the VorpX configuration tool by hitting Apply and Close. A lot of games use Unreal Engine 3. Know that this engine does have a generic profile available under local profiles in the VorpX configuration utility. So if you are sure the game you want to play uses that, simply use that profile and copy it for whatever you're planning to play. An example of this scenario was when I configured VorpX to work with the game's singularity. At this point, you're set to go with your custom profile. As with any game you intend to use with VorpX, if you've never started it before, launch it in 2D without VorpX and keep your runtimes, either Oculus Home or SteamVR, off. At this point, you can also take the time to go in the game's graphics options to set a few things. If you're left on your own to select the graphics resolution for your game, which should be the case with many manual VR configurations, normally the best resolutions are either at a 4:3 or 5:4 aspect ratio. You'll want the resolution adjusted to the strength of your graphics adapter. For the low-end systems using a GTX 1060 or equivalent, look to use 1280 by 960, 1280 by 1024, or maybe 1400 by 1050 if the other two aren't available. On a mid-end system with the equivalent of a GTX 1070, 1400 by 1050 can work well, or you can use the slightly higher resolutions like 1440 by 1080 or 1600 by 1024. For the higher end systems using the equivalent of a GTX 1080 or greater, 1600 by 1200 is the ideal resolution, but you can also look for 1600 by 1280 or 1680 by 1050. Remember, in most cases, VorpX may override this when you first play the game in VR, and while we'll sometimes try to customize that, you should be already set to go with decent results just based on what VorpX sets for you. There are some cases where you can toggle the preset resolutions right in the VorpX in-game menu under the DirectVR category. In most cases, unless your monitor is 4:3 or 5:4 aspect ratio, these games will require running in windowed mode. Windowed mode can sometimes come with mouse focus issues, causing your pointer to fly out of the game and click on your desktop or another program. To prevent this, most games will have a borderless window mode, and some games like Fallout 4 even have a topmost window option. Options like this should be checked on or selected if available. While VorpX's developers are attempting to minimize mouse pointer capture issues, the focus loss issue is still very much present with games like BioShock Infinite, and thus it's still important to take precautions to avoid this problem. For example, with that game in particular, I recommend disabling VorpX's automatic game resolution feature and running BioShock Infinite in borderless full screen at 1920 by 1080 instead. So far, though, it's the only game that hasn't complied with the latest version of VorpX in this regard. Another problem that can arise is the game window will try to stretch to fill your desktop. Most times, there is an option in the settings to prevent windowed mode from trying to fill the screen. In our series, I'll point these options out for each game when necessary. Refer to the tips I gave on graphics detail settings in the first section of this video. Make your choices, save them, and exit the game. Now get your VR runtimes ready, start VorpX, and launch your game again. This time around, it'll launch in VR. Start a new game and get past the introduction movies and cutscenes. Once you're given full control, the first step is to configure your field of view, possibly the most difficult step to do manually. It'll be hard to tell if you got this setting right, and there's a few ways to finally get the correct output. What we want here is an image that fills your view with as little visible edges as possible, preferably no edges at all, but also an image that isn't stretched out to the point where it's blurry. The first thing you'll want to do is set a field of view value for your game. I normally start with numbers around 95 to 120 degrees depending on what I'm playing. It is easier to do with games that allow for on-the-fly adjustments through a menu, but you'll often find yourself having to edit a configuration file in order to change this, which means you'll have to restart the game each time to see your change take effect. In some cases, assistance from a third-party tool like Flawless Widescreen may be necessary if the game has no built-in option or configuration files you can access. Again, for this type of setting, consult PC Gaming Wiki if you're having problems. Start with a value of 110 degrees. In the game world, stand near an object that you can easily recognize, a vehicle, furniture, or even a person. Keep in mind that the apparent scale of this object isn't directly affected by your field of view. Rather, this may have to do with 3D strength, which we'll cover later in this video. Before we start tinkering with the field of view values, open the VorpX in-game menu, go to the image settings category and lower image zoom to 0.9 so we can have a starting point that allows us to diagnose our setting. This value of 0.9 will also result in a sharper game output without stretching the image too much, resulting in a better looking image. Also, for games that support Geometry 3D, you'll often find an option called 3D Field of View Boost, which can be found in VorpX's in-game menu under Main Settings. I rarely ever use this option unless I absolutely have to, because it tends to cause glitches in the game, such as objects popping in and out of view along the edges of the game's image. While standing near the object of your choice, stare at your target and look up and down, then left and right. You'll immediately be able to tell if your value is on point or not. Just is going to be hard to tell if the field of view is too large or too small if it's not set correctly. My rule of thumb is fairly simple. If it feels like you're always far away from this object, then your field of view value is too high. If it feels like your face is being pushed into this object by force, or that the object appears flattened, your field of view value is too low. The best way to find out if you need to increase or decrease your field of view value is by opening the VorpX in-game menu, going to image settings, and changing the image zoom value. If you think your field of view is too high, increase the image zoom value. If you think your field of view value is too low, decrease the image zoom value. Yes, decreasing image zoom too much will bring visible edges into view, but this is only temporary. If you find that increasing image zoom gets you closer to a correct field of view, then it means your game's own field of view value is too high. Lower your game's field of view value by 5 degrees, bring back down your image zoom to 0.9 and redo this verification. If you feel like your field of view becomes correct by lowering your image zoom value, then it means your game's field of view value is too low. Bring it up by 5 degrees and try this verification again. What we're trying to get here is a field of view that looks correct with image zoom staying on 0.9. Sometimes you have to make a compromise. There are games that won't allow you to go past a certain point, and this can result in a stalemate, where you can't seem to get a good match between the image zoom being at 0.9 and the game's field of view setting being at the maximum. There are two compromises you can use to get around this. The first is to lower image zoom. I've found in many cases that going as low as 0.85 still results in an image with little visible edges, yet finally reaches the field of view you need. Another compromise, if you're close enough to the field of view you need, is to use 3D FOV boost when it's available. Only use that option if you're incredibly close to what you need, or if all other methods have failed. An example of a game where I had to use more 3D FOV boost than I wanted is Layers of Fear. Typically, if I'm using this option, the highest I'll want to go to is 1.15, but sometimes you have no choice to go even higher. Past 1.25, most games will start showing visual artifacts and glitches, so be careful with that option. When your field of view is finally correct, you'll get an image that doesn't warp, or feel distant from what you're looking at, or flattened. While it's very hard to tell if your field of view is too large or too small when it's not correct, it is easy to tell when you've got it right. The game view will feel natural when you look up and down and side to side. Be wary of another issue with a few games. Sometimes the head model and camera is moved a bit forward when you look straight ahead and a bit backwards when you look side to side. This can give you the impression that your field of view is slightly off, But if you observe carefully, you'll see that this is caused by the motion of the camera itself. I've seen this issue in Shadow Warrior 2013, and it made things tricky until I found out what the problem was. Bottom line, in most cases I've gotten a good balance between the game's field of view setting, when available, and the image zoom setting and the 3D field of view boost. For most games, if you spend a few minutes, you'll definitely get good results. Also, fortunately, if I create a tutorial for a specific game, I'll simply show you the values I found best after going through this process myself. The next important setting is the head tracking sensitivity value, which you'll find under head tracking settings. Considering you've configured your field of view properly, or at least very close to, this step is very easy. It can take a few tries, but the process itself is simple. We're going to do the shoulder-to-shoulder trick. Put the head tracking sensitivity setting at 0.4 for a starting point. First, if your game has a mouse sensitivity option, set it to what works best for you and avoid changing it from here on, as the head tracking sensitivity will be affected if you make any changes to mouse sensitivity. Stand somewhere in the game world and look straight ahead. Adjust your vertical axis with your mouse to make sure your in-game view is level. Slowly turn your head left until you touch your left shoulder with your chin. This should have produced a 90-degree rotation in-game, and you should be looking 90 degrees to the left. If the in-game view didn't turn as much as you did, your setting is too low. Increase it by 0.05. If the in-game view turned too much, your head tracking setting is too high. Lower the value by 0.05. Try the same verification we just did after doing your change, and repeat as much as necessary. Once you get close to what you think is correct, repeat this process but work in increments of 0.01 to find the exact sweet spot for this game. Working in small increments with this setting does have a lot of effect and should get you a perfect result. Finally, repeat this test by looking over to your left and over to your right, verifying that your real rotation matches your in-game rotation. In most cases, I was near 0.4, but this is probably the one setting that changes the most from game to game. Remember, with the latest version of VorpX, when the game is fully supported, you might just get the correct value out of the box and not need to change anything. This is really a process you'll need to go through only for a fully custom configuration, or for a game in which you've changed the mouse sensitivity value in. Last but not least is the positional tracking, which you'll find the option for under head tracking settings as well. Not all games will work well with this option, so I encourage you to try playing with it off, then with it back to on. When it's active, I've seen some games mess up the aim accuracy, others having a terrible relation between your character model and your position, and finally some games downright having graphical glitches because of it. In my case, I've always given the option a chance, but when I see problems arise, I simply turn it off. It's more immersive to be able to use this option, but having to disable it isn't a big loss. In fact, in a few cases, I found having positional tracking off results in the game detecting your positional changes as actual movement, which isn't too bad. Finally, with manual VR, you will have problems keeping your own head's y-axis, or vertical axis, matching the in-game view's y-axis. This can really disorient, even make you dizzy. There are several tricks to address this, but my personal favorite is the pitch-locked mouse. I basically purchased a mechanical ball mouse and blocked the vertical axis sensor inside, turning the mouse into a yaw-only input, thus making VorpX's head tracking the only thing capable of sending vertical axis input to the game I'm playing. This improves the situation with a lot of games, and while some drifting will remain, to date, this is the best way I've found to eliminate as much pitch offset as possible. I keep my real mouse nearby during gameplay in case I want to readjust the pitch in the case an offset forms, which even with this trick will happen regularly. VorpX does have a non-DirectVR pitch locking option to help with this, but it's nowhere near as effective as it drifts like crazy and will way too often require readjustments. If you found a game you really like to play in VR and are facing the drifting pitch problem, my top recommendation is trying the modified mechanical mouse. "3D reconstruction is one of the most important settings that will go a long way into making your VR experience more immersive. You'll find this setting in the VorpX in-game menu under Main Settings, and the options available will vary from game to game, but our ideal choice will be Geometry 3D along with values that provide a realistic impression of world scale, meaning objects won't look massive, or worse, small to the point where it feels like you're a disembodied head floating around in a dollhouse. In some cases, we'll have to use an artificial reconstruction, in which case we'll try to avoid having it look like we're playing in a world of cardboard cutout figures. There are up to 4 settings for 3D reconstruction. Z-Normal. This is often the default, and while it's not very good, it can serve as a fallback for older GPUs, as the game will be able to run much faster using this. Typically, you'll want to blast the strength setting to the max and put the depth weighing to an absolute minimum. It's very hard to gauge if you've gotten your world scale correct with this option, since objects near you will appear to lose depth to them and seem to flatten as they get closer. So try to use something that appears to be more than 20 feet away from you for scale reference. If you find the objects in the world seem too small, lower the strength. This is rare, as normally the depth strength will be too weak and thus needs to be at the max. If you find that objects in the horizon look like nearby cardboard cutouts, your depth weighing is too strong, lower it. Depth in very distant objects should not be discernible. Although using Z-Normal can help with performance, it's really not recommended. First, it may not work, and if you have a higher-end system, geometry is immediately preferable, but in some odd cases, Z-Normal can work uncharacteristically well, like for example with GTA VIVE, which up till recently only supported Z-Normal, yet looked pretty damn good despite. The next option is Z-Adaptive. Z-Adaptive is similar to Z-Normal, but as the name suggests, it will adaptively adjust the depth according to a given scene. This has proven to help with depth in nearby objects, a weakness of Z-Normal, but the problem with Z-Adaptive is that it performs the number one crime any 3D reconstruction can commit. The world scale will vary constantly, which can work against VR immersion. This is a setting that I simply cannot recommend, and I'll skip it. Geometry 3D is our preferred option. This is the option everyone wants. Even if your game is struggling a bit with Geometry 3D due to GPU limitations, most people will agree it's better to spare a bit on frame rate and get authentic 3D instead. That's right, Geometry 3D is for real. Instead of artificially reconstructing the stereoscopic image, it actually films the game world in true stereoscopic 3D. This means that suddenly the game is using 2 in-game cameras, and thus the demand on performance doubles. But the end result is a very believable, true-to-life version of the game world you're looking at. Typically, you'll want the separation strength at 0.7. It can vary from game to game very slightly, but for the most part it's a great starting point that will immediately work about 70% of the time. An example of an exception would be Borderlands, where the setting had to come as low as 0.4 for anything in the game world not to look like it's toy-sized. The best reference to verify if you've gotten your separation strength correctly is to find a human model in the game and stand next to it. It's the most easily recognizable figure for anyone, and it will make any misconfigured scale apparent. The lower the separation is, the larger things will look, and the higher the separation, the smaller things will look. Geometry 3D enables the ability to force enlarge the field of view using the 3D FOV boost option. This can come in very handy for games that don't allow you to increase the field of view at all, but the feature may very well cause glitches. A very well-known issue being objects outside of your center field of view will keep popping in and out of existence. The field of view boost can be of great use for cases where you just need a slight, tiny boost to make up for a setting you got wrong or a limit in the game's ability to blast the field of view. Always try plugins like Flawless Widescreen for field of view boosting before you resort to any 3D FOV boost. Last note on Geometry 3D, in a lot of games, gun and hand models will not render at the correct depth. This is a well-known issue and I've seen it all too often. Hand models at the correct depth are very hard to come by in third-party VR. Examples of bad hand model depths I can give are Portal and Fallout 4, where the weapons and hands are so far off that they look flat. Another example, but less prominent, would be Borderlands 1 and 2, where the hand models simply always look too massive. There is no known workaround for now if this issue is present in the game you're trying, but for the most part, games that have this issue are still very enjoyable. It's just good to know that the issue exists beforehand. The last 3D reconstruction setting is off. If a game needs to run with the off option, best just not play it in VR at all. This is an option you never want to have to fall back to as it eliminates all world scale and thus kills immersion completely. There's 4 more settings I want to point out, settings that apply to both DirectVR or manual VR. First, Crystal Image and G3D Shadow Treatment, both found under the Image Settings category. Crystal Image is a process that attempts to increase the sharpness of the image. In some games, it'll improve the visuals, but in others, it might damage them. The feature has 3 options: low, normal, and aggressive. Adjust them to your preference from game to game, but keep in mind that low may give you a performance boost as it makes this process go dormant. G3D Shadow Treatment is what I like to call eyesore control. If you find that shadows are rendering at the wrong depth, in essence, they hurt the eyes when you look at them, then you may want to set this option to turn off. In some games, auto has proven to work best, but at most times, especially with DirectX 11 games, you'll need to use the turn off option. Last in image settings is HUD scale. This feature is important in many games as it helps adjust the size of your heads-up display, allowing you to see your health, ammo count, and other important in-game information. You want to adjust it to a value that makes it small enough to fit your immediate view, but large enough to keep the text readable. This will vary from game to game, but generally a value of 0.5 is a good starting point. Unfortunately though, you'll notice this option does not function in a handful of titles. Heads-up displays will be covered individually in our game-specific tutorials. Another very important setting, this time under the Display Settings category, is Direct Mode Fluid Sync. If you're using a lower-end GPU, you may want to experiment with Direct Mode Fluid Sync, but with higher-end hardware, for most game, you'll want to make sure this option is off. Fluid Sync forces the game to cap at 45 frames per second and relies on the asynchronous time warp doing the rest of the work. It's fairly ineffective and results in a very floaty movement and can produce serious motion sickness due to frame lag. There's a really useful feature in VorpX. If you want to know the frame rate your game is getting in VR, hit Alt and F, which is the shortcut key to open VorpX's frame rate meter. This meter has an advantage over any other you'll use. It's going to show you not only the rate you're getting in the headset, but also the rate the game is sending to your runtimes. See, since virtual reality uses a synchronous time warp in order to fill in missing frames, most meters won't actually be capable of displaying you the frame rate after this process. VorpX, on the other hand, will tell you what frame rate your game is really running at, the game FPS, along with the resulting frame rate after a synchronous time warp is performed, the direct mode FPS. This can help tell when a game is struggling despite the asynchronous time warp doing a good job compensating. You'll also be able to tell if VSync or direct mode fluid sync is causing a frame rate cap of any kind. Finally, an option that can be incredibly useful for when you cannot see the edges of a menu, or when you want to watch a cutscene without feeling like your face is shoved into the game world and without having to switch VorpX into cinema mode, is the edge peak function. You can toggle edge peak by clicking your middle mouse button at any point while playing a game. I've made use of this feature a lot for inventory menus, cutscenes, and other moments where the full VR view becomes momentarily inadequate. Here's an overview of everything we've gone through in this video in a compressed, itemized format. There will be a timecode referring to the points in this video where each item is detailed. In a lot of cases, VorpX should handle game resolution, field of view, and head tracking thanks to partial or complete DirectVR support. Make sure to disable Steam's desktop game theater if you're using SteamVR. This feature will cause a conflict with VorpX. In a few cases, VorpX should now be able to fully automatically configure your game, as is the case with Fallout 4 and BioShock Infinite. If you're doing the configuration manually, run and configure your game to run at a 4:3 or 5:4 aspect ratio, 1280 by 960, 1280 by 1024, or 1400 by 1050 for low-end hardware, 1400 by 1050, 1440 by 1080, or 1600 by 1024 for mid-range, 1600 by 1200, 1600 by 1280, or 1680 by 1050 for high-end hardware. Easy on the graphics settings. Shadows cost a lot and might not even work. Make sure motion blur is off. MSAA is nice but super costly. Artificial AA is terrible and should be turned off. If the game you want to play has no VorpX profile, make a copy of an existing VorpX profile based on another game that uses the same engine. For Unity 5 games, use the Firewatch profile. For Unreal Engine 3 games, use the Unreal Engine 3 profile. For manual VR, start with a field of view of 110 degrees if you can. Set image zoom to 0.9 as a starting point, and lower or raise image zoom to determine whether you need more or less field of view. If you feel like your game world is far from you, your field of view is too large. If you feel like your face is being shoved in the game world or objects look flat, it's too small. If you're raising image zoom to make the field of view correct, your field of view value is too high. If you're lowering image zoom to make the field of view correct, your field of view value is too low. If you can't quite lock on to the sweet spot for field of view, make a compromise by lowering image zoom as low as 0.85. If you still need more field of view and 3D field of view boost is available, use it with caution, preferably staying at or below 1.10. For the best, most realistic 3D, you want geometry reconstruction, which will work well at a separation strength of 0.7 most of the time. If you're stuck without geometry, use the Z normal reconstruction with depth strength on max and weighing at minimum. Shadow eyesores can be turned off by toggling the G3D shadow treatment setting to off. If your asynchronous time warp feels too aggressive, or your frame rate appears locked at 45 frames per second, check the fluid sync option. If it's on, it will be capping at 45 frames per second. DirectVR will not require doing any manual configuration other than 3D, G3D shadow treatment, and checking that fluid sync is off. The best way to fight vertical axis mismatching is by using a modified mechanical mouse that does not respond on the pitch axis. Some may think the gamepad will resolve the pitch issue, but it doesn't. First off, you'll need some y-axis input in order to be able to adjust any offset that builds, and secondly, the y-axis on a gamepad is as easy to accidentally hit as a mouse's y-axis, so you're left in the same situation. The gamepad will work with most games, but I don't recommend it. Both thumbstick head rotation and mouse head rotation will feel weird at first. The huge difference here is you'll easily be able to adapt to mouse rotation, while thumbstick rotation will continuously give you a wretched, unnatural feeling. I highly recommend taking the time to get used to mouse rotation, as it will really pay off down the line. You can use your motion controllers with VorpX, but they'll only serve as a sort of gamepad input. It's obviously near impossible for this tool to inject full motion immersion into games. If that were possible, game studios would be able to make all their past games into VR in under 5 minutes. It's a lot more complicated than that. This guide was designed to cover as many scenarios as possible in one shot, so while it covers a lot of bases, it's not perfectly adapted for all games. This revised universal guide serves as a reboot for my VorpX tutorial series, and game-specific tutorials that follow will now reflect the newest VorpX options. The videos that follow this one each cover one specific game and may refer to this video for any general settings. What you've seen here is pretty much my own approach to most games. Take this as a necessary starting point before you watch any future game-specific videos. If ever any video in this series is updated, the older version of the video will either be tagged as outdated at the start of the title in the case I completely remake it, or will be tagged as updated in case I need to give a follow-up on the original video. If you see this, look for a link to the new version of the tutorial or the follow-up video in the description. This method will apply to all videos in this VorpX series, so if a game gets its tutorial updated, its old video will link to the new one as well. VorpX Let's Play parts will have links to a tutorial for their respective games, provided it's available. Also, as I make the videos for each individual game, I'll make a list of links to each tutorial in this very video's description, given you're pretty much watching the parent video of the series. Expect to see a playlist on my channel for this series as well, along with playlists for all my Let's Plays of VorpX games. VorpX initially improved a lot when it had its own asynchronous time warp worked in during the development days of VR. It's gone another giant leap with the latest update, now offering a great deal of automation that should get a lot of games working without needing any complicated tutorials or setups. It's since enabled me to relive absolute gems. The stuff of a VR gamer's dreams, really, being able to exist in many game worlds that I initially grown fond of before the dawn of virtual reality. Shadow Warrior 2013 was an absolutely stunning VR experience, proving that even manual VR can pull off wonders. BioShock Infinite is something I highly recommend playing end-to-end in VR, even if you've already experienced it on the desktop in the past. To date, my copy of VorpX likely has over 350 hours of usage, maybe more considering I've often run tests without recording, did some sessions that were never published, and even ran a bit of non-Steam stuff that I can't keep track of hour counts on. For under $50, it's actually pretty unbelievable, since even though it cannot enable VR in all the games that exist, it at least has 30 titles that can be run in VR with excellent degrees of success, and will thus expand your VR library in one shot for a pretty low price. I've seen a lot of people misuse VorpX and quickly toss an incorrect judgment down a staircase out of frustration, but know that these individuals' conclusions are wrong. If you know what you're doing and you know where you're going, you will have great results with this tool. Even in cases where you try an obscure game that's not supported, you might pull off interesting results, close enough to unexpectedly enjoy yet another game world in VR. Look, I've been in mysterious Japanese towns covered in demons, in the Middle East being chased by skeleton wolves, in the arid Badlands shooting skags, been to Colombia walking on clouds, to post-nuclear apocalyptic alternate universe Boston, and many other places. So many through all the tests I can't recall them off the top of my head. VorpX is like a VR private jet that lets you fly into a shit ton of games. It's also more than just VR tourism. In most places you go, there's also a game to play, and it's probably not a fucking wave shooter. The main turnoff for VorpX is the time it can take to configure a game. For me, this process started by taking a little over an hour, sometimes two. However, since I've sort of gotten the hang of most elements, a new game can take me as little as 15 minutes to configure by now. Toss in DirectVR in the mix, and we're down to just over 5 minutes. This video should help you reach the same type of setup time. Once you get the hang of basic elements explained in this feature, you'll be on your way to doing your own experimentation, I'm sure, as when the basics become easy, trying stuff becomes extremely tempting. That's it for now. Expect for the series of game-specific videos to restart soon. I'm likely going to cover Shadow Warrior 2 first, a game that I've developed a very efficient manual VR configuration for, and a game that to me serves as a great follow-up to the 2013 original, which I've played end-to-end using VorpX, and I've gone back to a few times given its addicting nature. Until then, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.